Welcome to the Sovereign Thinker, where history, philosophy, and geopolitics come together. And today, I'm diving into one of the most significant, perhaps misunderstood conflicts of our time, the Russo-Ukrainian War. But before I get into the specifics of this war, I want to be clear about something. Here at the Sovereign Thinker, we do not entertain simplistic media narratives, and you know the kind I'm talking about. The Hollywood movie versions of events, where there's always a hero, always a villain, everything is black and white, democracies versus everyone else. This type of ideological thinking is not how the world works, and this is certainly not how geopolitics works. These narratives are designed to distract and, more importantly, to galvanize public opinion to sell a story. History is riddled with ideological argumentation to justify wars. Romans versus barbarians, Christians versus pagans, civilized Europeans versus the uncivilized, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, these narratives do not tell us what's really going on behind the scene. And if we're serious about understanding global events, if we're serious about understanding why wars are fought and why nations make the choices they do, then we need to step away from the stories and focus on the geopolitical realities. And that's exactly what we're going to do here today. So what do I mean by geopolitical realities? Well, I'm talking about the fundamental, unchanging forces that drives nations and shape the course of history. Forces such as geography, economics, trade, demography, culture, history, philosophy. These are the things that are important, and these are the forces that shape national interests. These forces push countries to act the way they do. Think of them like Adam Smith's invisible hand, but instead of guiding markets, these forces guide nations. They shape policies, value systems, and even the way people perceive the world. And if there's one conflict where these forces are playing out in full view, it's the Russo-Ukrainian War. And today, I want to break down this conflict in a way that avoids ideology, avoids the easy narrative, and gets straight to the heart of the matter. The way I want to tackle this topic is to divide this episode into two parts. The first will examine Russia's geography, how land itself makes Russia both strong and weak, and how geography shapes its vulnerabilities. Then we'll look into how Russia's geographical challenges have driven its decisions over the centuries, including its wars and expansions. And then, once we get all this context out of the way or in place, then the second part of this episode will answer the big question or questions such as, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Was it really an unprovoked attack? Or is this just another case of aggression of one country against another? But before I jump in, I want to emphasize that this war isn't happening in a vacuum. To truly understand it, we need to go back and look at history and look at how geography has dictated Russia's behavior, both today and throughout history. First things first, let's get the obvious out of the way. Russia is massive. There's no denying that. But here's the thing, despite its size, Russia is incredibly vulnerable. And this all boils down to its geography. The heart of Russia, its historical core, or the Heartland, includes modern-day European Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Baltic states. This region is known as the Heartland, and it's key to understanding Russia's geographical problems. To understand these geographical problems, we need to look at two critical geographical features that define this Heartland. On the one side, we have the Northern European Plain, which stretches from northern France across Germany and Poland and then opens up like a funnel, like the opening end of a funnel into the Heartland. And on the other side, we have the Great Eurasian Steppe, which stretches all the way from Eastern Europe to Mongolia. The European Plain, which comes from the west, and the Eurasian Steppe, which comes from the east, both meet or connect smack bang in the middle of the Heartland. And all three of them, the European Plain, the Eurasian Steppe, and the Heartland, are marked by one geographical feature. It's all flat and open. But for the purpose of our discussion, we're focusing more on the Northern European Plain, and here's why it's so important. As I just mentioned, the plain is flat, it's wide open. there are no natural barriers along the European plain, meaning there are no mountains, no deserts, no oceans, no seas, anything of that nature that can potentially act as a natural border. And it's essentially an enormous, just enormous funnel that opens up once it reaches the heartland. And that makes it incredibly easy to move armies across or to invade the heartland. Think of it like as a superhighway where Western European armies have marched across these plains time and time again throughout Russian history. Napoleon did it, Hitler did it, even the Mongolians have done it, and they exploited these plains, but this time from the east, from the Eurasian steppe. Each invasion was absolutely devastating. Invasion after invasion has made possible because Russia's heartland is completely exposed on this open plain. There's nothing to stop an advancing army from moving straight into Russian territory. And this brings us to the heart of Russia's security concerns. While Russia is difficult to hold, and many have tried throughout history and many have failed, but it is actually disturbingly easy to invade. When once you're inside the heartland, there's nothing but open space or open land between you and Moscow. And for Russia, that is the core of its vulnerability. Now, when a nation is this exposed, the cost of every invasion are catastrophic. Cities are leveled, people are displaced or killed, and economies are shattered. Think about this just for a moment. When you have no mountains or seas to defend you, your only option is to use your people, your citizens, and your cities as your defense. That means you have to turn every town into a fortress, and you have to sacrifice human lives with the hopes of potentially slowing the enemy down. This has been Russia's reality for centuries, and it's an absolutely brutal and unsustainable way to defend a nation. Each invasion brings with it devastation, and no country can function in the long term with such vulnerability hanging over it. So, what does Russia do about this? Well, Russia's historical solution has been expansion. It's essentially conquer or be conquered. But this expansion wasn't about greed or building an empire for empire's sake. It was driven by a much more primal need, security. Russia needed to push its borders out as far as possible, seeking natural barriers that could shield it from invasions. So, to understand Russia's actions today, we need to look at the leaders who understood their country's vulnerabilities in the past and made decisions based on those realities. And one such leader was Ivan IV, or perhaps more commonly known as Ivan the Terrible. When Ivan took power in the 16th century, Russia at the time was in a precarious position. It was surrounded by hostile nations, all vying to get further into the heartland. They had Sweden to the northwest, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth directly to the west, the Ottoman Empire to the south, and the various khanates that were left over from the Mongolian Empire to the east. In addition to all this, Moscow also just emerged as an independent state after decades of being under the Mongol yoke, or being a Mongol vassal. So before Russia could even begin to recompose herself, she was already in a sticky situation. Russia was hemmed in on all sides, and Ivan knew this. He knew that if Russia were to survive and not be under the foot of yet another foreign power, it had to expand, not for wealth or trade, but to secure its future. Obviously, if Russia were able to gain some wealth or trade from its various expansions, then of course this was an added bonus. But the real motivation behind the expansions were Russia needed defensible borders. And over the centuries, Russia painstakingly expanded outward, pushing its borders all the way to the Altai Mountains in the east, the Pacific Ocean to the far east, the Iranian Plateau, the Caucasus Mountains to the south, and the frozen Arctic to the north. But once Russia found these barriers, they rarely went beyond them. Of course, throughout history, there are cases where they went beyond these barriers, but these are more exceptions than the rule itself. And if you know any instances where the Russians went beyond these barriers and would like me to break down the reasons why they did so, please let me know in the comments below. I'll be happy to do a video in the future. But despite all this expansion, one vulnerability remained, and that was the northern European plain. The northern European plain is essentially Russia's eternal Achilles heel of geography, and it remains a focal point of Russian security to this very day. Fast forward to the 18th century and we meet Peter the Great, one of Russia's most significant rulers. Now, under Peter, Russia faced another critical challenge: access to the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea was massively important at that time, not just for Russia, but for many nations in that area. And at that time, Sweden was the dominant power in the Baltic Sea. And along with this, they also controlled the coastlines of the Baltic states, mostly encompassing the modern day states of the Baltics: Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In other words, Sweden had a foothold within the Heartland itself, and they could use the Baltics as a launching pad to strike deep into the core of Russia, i.e. Moscow. And in this position, Sweden had escalation dominance, a very important term to understand: escalation dominance. The ability to strike at Russia with far more ease than Russia could strike back. This, in the world of diplomacy, is known as leverage. This strategic imbalance gave Sweden the upper hand in its relations towards Russia, since it could cause Russia more damage than Russia could cause Sweden. This made Russia obviously very vulnerable, and Peter knew this had to be addressed. So, what did Peter the Great do about this? Well, to be completely frank, he went to war with Sweden, and this war was called the Great Northern War. Peter's main goal: the Baltics, and well, more specifically, the Baltic coastline. To have a sea separating you from your rival is a great way to shore up your defenses. And after years of bloody conflict, Russia finally won access to the Baltic Sea and secured the main or the key territories of the Baltics, which were at the time called Ingria, Livonia, and Estonia. Securing these territories also gave Russia access to the trade and commercial activities within the Baltic Sea and allowed Peter to establish the new Russian capital, which he named after himself, St. Petersburg, in 1703. By the way, St. Petersburg wasn't just a new capital, it was a crucial port city that helped Russia create commercial trade routes within the Baltic Sea, and this helped Russia financially sustain the massive, mostly unprofitable landmass that was the Russian Empire. But more importantly, it secured Russia's northern flank. Wait, actually, just a quick side note, a point of clarification. The Russian Empire, again, being the massive landmass that it was in many ways an economic burden. There were some trade routes and raw materials that brought in Russians some income, perhaps most famously fur, but to maintain this massive landmass was rather uncompetitive and way less profitable when compared to other European empires at the time, like Britain, whose wealth essentially came from oceanic trade routes, colonies, etc. But Russia wasn't willing to concede some of the land that he had acquired to ease the economic burden. And that is kind of the nature of geopolitics. Security trumps economic benefits, because you cannot have a thriving economy without security. But okay, back to the Northern War. The Great Northern War has often been portrayed as ruthless Russian expansion, but the reality was that Russia really didn't have a choice. Russia needed to correct the strategic imbalance between itself and Sweden, and it also had to get a foothold in the Baltic Sea to sustain this security empire that was now slowly forming. Now, let's turn to the south. For centuries, Russia's southern border was blocked by the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the Black Sea, and in a similar fashion with Sweden, the Ottomans had escalatory dominance from the south as they controlled Crimea as well as the southern part of modern-day Ukraine. Well, actually, the southern part now is controlled by Russia since 2022, but we'll obviously get to that soon. But anyway, like Sweden, it was super easy for the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars to launch raids into the Russian core, since they had a foothold within the heartland. And so for Russia, access to the Black Sea was critical, not just for trade, but for securing its southern flanks. Crimea, with its port city of Sevastopol, was the key. Sevastopol provided access to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus Strait and was one of Russia's only warm water ports that could operate year-round. But more importantly, the Crimean Peninsula itself also acted as a natural fortress. Its high ridges and defensible coastline made it a protective shield for the Russian heartland, and any invader would have to take Crimea first before attempting to march into Russia proper, and hence why the Russians fought relentlessly to take these lands and Crimea obviously away from the Ottomans. And as we saw before with Sweden, this was done to correct the strategic imbalance existing between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. So, throughout a series of wars in the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia was successful and absorbed Crimea in 1783, a vital piece of land for Russia's survival. So, while Russia secured its northern and southern borders, there was still another key concern: Poland. Poland, which sits on the northern European plain. The northern European plain, which is Russia's Achilles heel. Western powers were still able to march right through Poland and directly into the heartland. Actually, just a quick side note, Poland in most Slavic languages is called Polska, meaning the land of the fields or the land of the plains, which actually amply describes Poland's reality since it's a country that's sitting almost entirely on the northern European plain. Since Russia is exposed to the European plain, which again stretches all the way from northern France to the heartland and is approximately 600 kilometers wide, there's actually not much Russia can do here. It's quite a massive gap or funnel that opens into the heartland. And even Polish armies themselves had often moved into heartland, and they even managed to burn Moscow to the ground. The burning of Moscow happened during a period called the Times of Troubles. This is a fascinating period in Russian history for many reasons, but it also highlights Russia's security concerns. And if you want me to do a video about the Times of Troubles, then don't hesitate to drop a comment in the comment section below. From Russia's perspective, the Poles were simply too troublesome, and the Polish aims to expand eastward into the heartland was obviously a direct challenge to Russia's security interests. And therefore, these two countries were on a collision course. And ultimately, Poland was the one that lost and got turned into a buffer state. And as a buffer state, Poland became significant for Moscow because it's the space on the flat European plains that lies between the heartland and the major powers of Western Europe. By controlling Poland, Russia could limit the threat coming from the Poles themselves, as well as push its defensive lines westward and create a buffer zone between itself and potential enemies. The further Russia goes west on the flat European plain, the more distance it can create between invading armies and the heartland. It's important to note, while Poland is a buffer state, Ukraine is different. Ukraine is often described as a buffer state as well, but Ukraine is an integral part of the heartland. The same European plains that go through Poland and open up into Russia also open up into Ukraine, meaning for Russia, the security of Ukraine is the security of Russia itself and vice versa. Losing Ukraine to a foreign power would unbalance the heartland, and this without a doubt is an existential threat to Russia's core. Now, I'm not going to go through the entirety of Russian history, so let's fast forward to the Cold War. After the devastation of the Second World War, Russia found itself in a new global conflict, the Cold War, and its western border, which has always been an historical weak point, was now directly facing NATO. And in 1949, NATO was formed as a military alliance to counter the Soviet Union. And from Moscow's perspective, this was a direct threat to its security. And to counter this, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955, so 6 years later, pulling in Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany into its sphere of influence. But here's the thing. The Warsaw Pact wasn't about aggression. Despite what you may have heard or read in history books and so on, Russia wasn't trying to march on Western Europe. Instead, the Warsaw Pact was a reactionary, defensive measure against the traditional threat emanating from Western Europe. But now, this threat had increased astronomically because there was a new power on the block, the United States of America. And let's not forget, just a few years before the forming of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, Russia, scarred by the millions of lives lost to the Nazis, whose life as a nation hung by the thinnest of threads in a war against Germany, was now witnessing an even more powerful military alliance forming in Western Europe. Creating the Warsaw Pact was once again Russia's attempt to secure its western borders. It was a burden for Moscow to absorb these Eastern European countries into a military alliance. these countries didn't really offer Moscow any economic benefits or anything the Russians didn't already have themselves, let's say in terms of raw materials. But for Moscow, who just went through one of the most destructive wars in its history, was now faced with the enormous task of rebuilding. And this was a monumental task. But not only did they have to allocate resources to this, to rebuild their own country, they had to allocate resources to build Eastern Europe as well, who, by the way, was also completely wrecked after the Second World War. For Moscow, the reality was, at that time, they would have just preferred to leave Eastern European alone and to simply focus on themselves. But like I said before, security trumps economics. Moscow feared that if it left the Eastern Europeans to their own devices, they would eventually be swallowed or absorbed by US institutions like NATO, eventually leading to this powerful military alliance to their border. And now, well, in retrospect, were they wrong to think this? Because as we all know now, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, along with the Warsaw Pact, what did the Americans do? Well, they pushed their alliance further eastward to the Russian border. I'm going to take a pause here right now. I could talk for hours providing historical examples of how security has dictated Russian decision-making processes, but I think you guys get the point. This video wasn't made to defend or excuse Russia. It is simply trying to highlight the logic behind Russia's decisions, which again were primarily based off their geographical vulnerabilities. Russian history is defined by one devastating invasion after another. This has obviously left the Russians and their leadership with deep psychological impacts. Think about the Jews and the history of their struggle, including the Holocaust. Such traumatic events has impacted their national psyches so deeply that it has resulted in them too forming a particular worldview. And such worldviews has led them to make real-world decisions throughout the course of their history. And it's similar with the Russians. We can debate whether Russian actions are right or wrong, but the reality is what it is. They have a fear of being invaded. Russia has often been portrayed as the bad guy, and its actions are driven by imperialistic ambitions, and on the surface it very much looks like this. But if you dig a little deeper, it all boils down to Russia's geographical vulnerabilities, its historical invasions, and the lack of natural borders, which ultimately have shaped its policies for centuries. I want to leave you guys with this final thought, and the thought is, if Russia were offered genuine security guarantees, it could address the centuries-old concerns at the heart of its policies. In turn, Europe would finally have a pathway to lasting security. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive into Russia's geopolitical realities. After providing much needed context, Part 2 of this video will talk about the Russo-Ukrainian War. As we've seen, understanding geopolitical realities is the key to understanding why nations act the way they do. Stay tuned for more insights into how geopolitics shape our world right here on The Sovereign Thinker. Don't forget to like and subscribe.